The airport was always full of stories, hellos, goodbyes, reunions, and separations that blurred together in the hum of announcements and the shuffle of footsteps. Yet some stories began long before the first boarding call. This one began on a quiet evening, years earlier, when a single message lit up the corner of a phone screen and went forever unseen. Jonathan Miller was a man who measured his life in profits, schedules, and milestones carved out of long nights and relentless ambition. From the outside, he seemed untouchable. Every deal he closed was another headline. Every venture another step toward the empire he promised himself he would build. His office glowed with cold light, its glass walls reflecting his polished image back at him like a mirror he could not escape. People said he had everything: money, power, influence. But there were things he had quietly traded away for those very things: connections, tenderness, and the fragile threads of love that once tied him to Claire. That evening, his phone buzzed against the desk. He glanced at the screen, saw her name, and for a moment something flickered in him, an ache, perhaps, or a shadow of regret. He remembered their last argument, the sharp words, the silence that followed. Pride rose before compassion could break through. With a quick flick of his wrist, he turned the phone face down, burying himself in contracts that demanded signatures. He never read the message. On Claire's side, the same message sent but unseen, carrying within it the weight of a future Jonathan had never dared to imagine. It was not just words, it was proof of life, black and white lines on an ultrasound that revealed the fragile shapes, daughters. Her heart had raced when she pressed send, her fingers trembling with the hope that maybe this time he would open his heart. She had written only a few simple words, words that begged for nothing more than acknowledgement. They are ours. Each hour that passed without a reply widened the space between them. Claire stared at her screen until her eyes blurred, refreshing the chat window again and again as though willing it to change. But Jonathan's silence was its own kind of message. She placed her hand over the gentle curve of her stomach and whispered promises to the tiny lives growing inside her, promises that they would never feel unwanted, that she would fight for them even if she had to do it alone. Jonathan buried the thought under layers of work. He told himself it was for the best, that Claire deserved someone who wasn't consumed by ambition, that children would only hold him back from everything he was building. He convinced himself that not reading her message was a kind of mercy, though deep down he knew it was fear disguised as control. Fear of the unknown, fear of failing at something he could not quantify with numbers. Time moved forward, as it always does. Claire faced her pregnancy without him, enduring nights of exhaustion and mornings of quiet strength. When her daughters were born, she held them both against her chest, tears slipping down her face. Not because she was alone, but because she was not broken. She had created life, and in their tiny cries she heard both an ending and a beginning. Jonathan never knew the sound of those first cries, never saw the miracle of their first breaths. His silence had cost him more than he could ever calculate. Years slipped by. Jonathan's empire expanded, his wealth multiplied, and yet his heart grew quieter. He stood at galas, surrounded by strangers in tuxedos. He signed deals in glittering towers, and still there were moments when his chest felt hollow. At night, when the world finally stopped demanding his attention, his thoughts drifted to the message he had ignored. He never admitted it out loud, but sometimes he wondered what she had wanted to say. Still, his pride stopped him from asking. Claire, meanwhile, built a world for her daughters. She worked hard, piecing together stability with determination and love. Every bedtime story, every scraped knee she kissed, every moment she chose to smile instead of cry was a quiet act of courage. Her girls grew with laughter in their voices and curiosity in their eyes, unaware of the absence their mother carried inside her. She did not tell them about Jonathan, not yet. She wanted them to feel whole, to grow with love instead of longing. But in the quiet moments, she sometimes wondered how different things could have been if he had only opened that one message. And then came the airport. The arrivals hall was alive with anticipation, families pressed against the railings, children bouncing on their toes, lovers craning their necks to catch the first glimpse. Jonathan stood there, older now, a little more tired around the eyes despite the wealth that cloaked him. He hadn't come here looking for them, not consciously. Yet destiny does not always need an invitation. Across the hall, Claire walked hand in hand with two young girls. They had her smile, her eyes, but there was something else in them too. Something that mirrored Jonathan in ways he could not ignore. He froze, the noise of the airport fading into silence. Time folded in on itself, collapsing the years he had wasted. His throat tightened as he realized exactly what he was seeing. The daughters he had never known stood just a few steps away. The hook had finally closed. Jonathan's heart pounded harder than it ever had in a boardroom. The man who once stood unshaken while closing billion-dollar deals now found his knees unsteady. As he stared across the crowded airport, two young girls clung to Claire's hands, their laughter cutting through the hum of the terminal like bells. He should have stepped forward, should have called her name, but his voice caught in his throat. It felt as though the years of silence had wrapped chains around him. Heavy with all the words he had never spoken, Claire hadn't noticed him yet. Her focus was entirely on her daughters, guiding them through the crowd, adjusting the straps of their small backpacks, brushing hair gently from their faces. There was a tenderness in her movements that pierced through him. She looked older, not in the sense of fading, but stronger, carved by resilience. She had carried the weight of life alone, and it showed in the dignity of her posture, the steadiness of her steps. Jonathan's breath shortened. His daughters, the word thundered in his head, shaking the walls he had built over the years. He hadn't known the sound of their first cries, hadn't seen their first steps, hadn't heard them say mama for the first time. For years. Gone, for years buried in contracts, meetings, and endless ambition. And for what? His success suddenly seemed paper thin compared to the reality unfolding in front of him. The girls, curious and lively, tugged at Claire's hands, their eyes darting around the terminal. One of them, with hair that caught the light like strands of gold, pointed toward the glass where planes taxied across the runway. The other, darker-haired but just as bright-eyed, pulled at her mother's arm, urging her to hurry. Their giggles rose, and something in Jonathan's chest broke. He heard himself breathe out a sound that was half a laugh, half a sob. At that exact moment, Claire's eyes lifted. She scanned the crowd absent-mindedly, and then she saw him. Time slowed. Her steps faltered, her grip tightening instinctively on her daughter's hands. For a long, stretched heartbeat, neither of them moved. Their gazes locked, and the years between them flooded back memories of love once alive. The night of their argument, the silence that followed, and that message never answered. Jonathan's lips parted, but no words came. What could he possibly say? That he was sorry, that he hadn't known, that pride had blinded him? Words felt weak in the face of what stood before him. His daughters living, breathing proof of all he had lost by looking away. Claire's face was unreadable. There was no anger flaring, no tears spilling, no dramatic outburst, only calm strength. The kind that comes from years of standing tall even when the world tried to bend you. She looked at him as though she had already accepted he was nothing, more than a ghost from their past. The girls, oblivious to the storm in the air, tugged at her arms again. "Mama, who's that man looking at us?" one of them asked, her small voice carrying a kind of innocence Jonathan could barely bear. Claire hesitated. She opened her mouth, then closed it, struggling for an answer. The truth hovered on her lips, but so did the instinct to protect her daughters. She crouched down and whispered something to them that Jonathan couldn't hear. They nodded, their eyes still curious as they glanced back at him. Something inside him finally broke free. He stepped forward, his voice, rusty from years of silence, cracked as he spoke. "Claire," the single word carried every regret, every apology, every sleepless night he had pretended he didn't have. Claire stiffened, but did not move away. The girls clung to her hands tighter, watching him with wide eyes. For the first time in years, Jonathan wasn't the confident businessman who commanded boardrooms. He was just a man stripped of his pride, desperate for a chance to face the truth. His throat tightened. He wanted to tell them everything that he hadn't known, that he had been blind, that he was sorry for every day he had missed. But the words felt tangled, too fragile to bridge such a wide canyon. Claire stood tall, her expression calm, but her eyes heavy with memories. "Why now?" she asked softly. the question barely rising above the murmur of the crowd. It wasn't accusation, it was something deeper, something that carried both weariness and wonder. Jonathan swallowed hard, his chest burning. He didn't have an answer. Why now? Because fate had cornered him? Because he had been too much of a coward to look back before? Because he had finally realized that everything he had built was hollow? Without them, the girls shifted restlessly, and Claire bent to soothe them. In that moment, Jonathan saw how naturally she cared for them, how much love she had poured into raising them. He realized with painful clarity that she had given them everything he had withheld. "I didn't know," he whispered, though even as the words left him, he knew how weak they sounded. Claire's gaze pierced through him. "You didn't want to know," she replied. Her voice wasn't sharp, but it carried the weight of truth. The words cut deeper than any deal he had ever lost, any failure he had faced. He felt himself shrinking, stripped bare before her strength. For the first time in his life, he wanted to fight for something that numbers couldn't buy. The girls tugged again, their voices curious, innocent. "Mama, can we go now?" Claire gave them a small smile, the kind that carried both love and sorrow. She looked back at Jonathan one last time before turning toward the exit. And Jonathan, paralyzed, stood watching. The crowd moved around him, people rushing to their own reunions, their own stories, while he stood frozen. His chance had appeared, and already it was slipping away. But somewhere inside, beneath the crushing weight of regret, a spark flickered. A voice whispered that perhaps it wasn't too late. Not yet. The airport became more than just a meeting place for Jonathan. It became the line between the man he had been and the man he still had. The chance to become. Jonathan couldn't sleep. That night, he lay in the darkness of his penthouse, surrounded by silence that mocked him with its emptiness. The city glittered below, but the lights outside only reminded him of the ones he had seen shining in the eyes of the two little girls at the airport, his daughters. He had thought wealth and status could insulate him from pain, that success would erase every wound, but now he felt exposed, as if every deal, every luxury, every applause from strangers meant nothing. He replayed the moment again and again, the way Claire's eyes had looked through him, steady and unyielding, the way his daughters had clutched her hands, seeking comfort in the woman who had been everything to them. They hadn't known him to them. He was just a stranger staring too long, a man out of place in their story. That truth struck deeper than he expected. For years, he had been living as though nothing was missing. But now, everything felt missing. By dawn, he was pacing. His reflection in the glass wall caught his attention, and for the first time, he saw not the confident man others admired, but someone hollow. Lines etched his face that hadn't been there before. The weight of choices he had buried now surfacing. He thought of Claire, of her strength, of how she had raised their daughters. Without him, regret sat heavy, but beneath it flickered a resolve he hadn't felt in years. He knew this wouldn't be easy. He couldn't just show up and expect forgiveness, couldn't simply wave his wealth as if it was an apology. He needed to prove something deeper, that he could be present, that he could be the kind of father his daughters deserved, the kind of man Claire once believed he could be. But the question loomed. How? Jonathan started by searching for her. It didn't take long. With his resources, tracking her address was simple, but standing at her door was another matter. He found himself outside a modest townhouse, his heart racing as if he were about to negotiate the most important deal of his life. Through the window, he caught glimpses of a life he had missed, children's drawings taped to the walls, shoes scattered by the entryway, the sound of laughter spilling out faintly into the street. He raised his hand to knock but froze. What right did he have? 4 years of absence could not be erased by a single gesture. Yet walking away would only repeat the mistake he had made before. This time, he forced himself forward. His knuckles tapped against the door. Claire opened it, surprise flashing across her face before it cooled into caution. She stepped outside, pulling the door close behind her, as though shielding the world inside from him. "Why are you here, Jonathan?" Her voice was calm, but firm, carrying layers of exhaustion and guarded strength. He swallowed hard. "Because I saw them, and I can't pretend anymore." Her eyes searched his face. looking for cracks in the mask he had once worn so easily. You had your chance to be here. 4 years of chances. I know, he admitted quickly, and I can't undo it. But I want to try now, not for me, for them. His voice cracked, the weight of sincerity breaking through years of pride. Claire shook her head, her jaw tightening. You don't just walk back in and claim a place in their lives. You don't get to decide that when it's convenient for you. He expected her anger, expected the sting of truth, but hearing it still left him raw. He nodded slowly. I don't want to force my way in. I want to earn it, whatever it takes. Claire studied him for a long moment, as though weighing the man in front of her against the one she had once known. She sighed, not out of forgiveness, but out of the heaviness of decisions that weren't simple. They're happy, Jonathan. They don't know what they missed. I won't let anyone hurt them, not even you. The door cracked open, and a small voice interrupted. Mama, who's at the door? One of the girls peeked out, her wide eyes curious. The other followed, her hair falling over her face as she tried to see around her sister. Claire stiffened, but Jonathan's breath caught. Seeing them so close, so real, shook him to his core. His instinct was to drop to his knees, to speak, to reach out, but he held himself still, afraid of frightening them. Claire turned to them gently. Just someone I used to know, she said. Jonathan's chest ached at the words, but then one of the girls tilted her head, studying him. You look like me, she said innocently, her voice carrying a spark of truth neither adult could deny. The words pierced the air, fragile and powerful. Claire's composure faltered for the briefest moment, and Jonathan felt tears sting his eyes. He wanted to speak, but the lump in his throat made it impossible. Claire quickly ushered the girls back inside, promising she'd join them in a moment. When the door clicked shut, she faced Jonathan again. This time, her expression was softer, though no less guarded. They're smart, she said quietly. Smarter than you think. If they ask questions, I won't lie, but I won't let you break them either. If you want to be part of their lives, you'll need to prove it over time. Not with gifts or money, with presence, with consistency. Jonathan nodded, his resolve hardening. Then that's what I'll do, no matter how long it takes. For the first time in years, Claire didn't turn away. She simply looked at him, as if trying to decide whether hope could be allowed back into a place long sealed shut. Inside the house, the girls' laughter rang out again. Jonathan closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him like a promise, like a reminder of what was at stake. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. He knew trust could not be demanded, only earned. But he also knew this. He had been given a second chance, however fragile, and he would not let it slip away again. And as he walked away from the house that evening, his heart carried both the sting of regret and the spark of something new, determination. He had once ignored a message that could have changed his life. This time, he would listen with everything he had. Jonathan's life began to change in ways he hadn't expected. For years, his days had been dictated by calendars packed with meetings, his nights consumed with strategies and acquisitions. But now, the moments that mattered most weren't on any schedule. They were the small chances Claire allowed him to be near his daughters. She was cautious, never giving him too much at once. At first, it was simple, a brief visit in the park, where she stayed close, watching him as carefully as she watched the girls. He remembered the first time he saw them run across the grass, chasing each other with carefree laughter. His heart ached, realizing he had missed the joy of their first steps, the wonder of their first words, the tiny triumphs that had filled Claire's world while he buried himself in numbers. He sat on a bench, uncertain, feeling as if he were trespassing on a life that was never his. But then one of them, the darker-haired girl, paused and looked at him. She studied him with wide eyes, the kind of gaze children give when they're deciding whether someone belongs in their circle. Slowly, she held out a dandelion, the yellow petals crushed slightly in her small hand. Here, she said, her voice soft but steady. Jonathan felt his throat tighten. He took the flower carefully, as though it were something sacred. Thank you, he whispered, his voice trembling more than he wanted. She smiled briefly before running back to her sister, leaving him clutching that little gift as though it were worth more than everything he owned. Moments like that became his anchor, Each meeting was brief, but each left a mark on him. He started to notice things he had once overlooked, how the girls leaned into Claire when they were uncertain, how they found wonder in the simplest of things, how Claire's eyes softened whenever she looked at them, even when she was tired. Jonathan realized that fatherhood wasn't about grand gestures, but about showing up, about being steady and present in ways he had failed before. He made mistakes, of course. He once brought expensive toys, thinking they might bring joy, but the girls showed little interest. Instead, they preferred the games they made up themselves, the stories Claire told them at bedtime, the paper crafts they built out of nothing more than scissors and imagination. Jonathan learned quickly that love could not be bought, only lived. Claire noticed his effort, but remained guarded. She never spoke of forgiveness, never hinted at letting him deeper into their lives. Her silence was both a shield and a test. Still, Jonathan didn't turn away. Each time she allowed him near, he took it as a gift, and he treated it with the reverence of someone who knew how easily it could be taken away. There was one evening, months into this fragile rebuilding, that changed something inside him. Claire had agreed to let him join them for a picnic in the park. The girls brought a ball, and Jonathan watched them play, his heart swelling as they shouted his name for the first time, urging him to kick the ball back. It was clumsy, his suit shoes slipping in the grass, but their laughter filled the air, and for the first time, he felt as though he belonged in their world. Later, as the sun dipped low, Claire spread a blanket with sandwiches and fruit. The girls ran to fetch juice boxes, leaving the two of them in silence. Jonathan glanced at her, the words heavy on his tongue. "Thank you," he said quietly. She looked at him, cautious as always. "For what?" "For letting me try," he admitted. "For not shutting the door completely." Claire's expression softened just a fraction. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for them. They deserve to know the truth, even if it hurts." He nodded, accepting the weight of her words. He didn't expect her forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but he wanted her to know he understood. The girls returned, giggling as they handed him a juice box. He opened it clumsily, spilling a little, which sent them into peals of laughter. And in that moment, he realized that love was built not on perfection, but on presence, on being there, even in the small, messy moments. As the months passed, Jonathan began to shift his life in ways that surprised even him. He stepped back from endless late nights at the office, declining meetings that once felt indispensable. He found himself leaving deals unfinished, his mind preoccupied not with profits, but with the memory of his daughter's laughter. His colleagues whispered, confused by his sudden change, but Jonathan no longer cared. For the first time, ambition didn't fill the hollow inside him. Love did her still. The road wasn't smooth. There were days when Claire's trust seemed to slip further away, when she pulled back as though afraid he might disappoint them all over again. And each time, Jonathan reminded himself that trust wasn't a gift, it was something earned. Day by day, moment by moment, one evening, after months of tentative progress, Claire stood by the door as he prepared to leave. The girls were already in bed, their soft laughter fading upstairs. She hesitated, then spoke quietly. "They asked me tonight if you'll come back tomorrow." Jonathan's breath caught. He looked at her, searching for meaning in her eyes. "I told them," Claire continued, "that I don't know, that it depends on you." The words struck him with both hope and responsibility. It wasn't a promise, but it was an opening. It meant his daughters were beginning to expect him, to look for him, to want him there. "I'll be here," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of a vow. Claire studied him for a long moment, before finally nodding, and for the first time, she didn't close the door right away. She let him stand there, breathing in the fragile warmth of possibility, before stepping back inside. Jonathan walked away that night with a heart heavy but burning with determination. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew one thing. With clarity, he could no longer be the man who ignored the message, who turned his back on love. This time, he would listen, he would show up, he would prove himself not through words, but through presence. And as he disappeared into the night, a thought whispered inside him, both terrifying and hopeful. Perhaps redemption was possible. After all, the first snow of the season drifted across the city, softening its noise and bright lights. Jonathan watched it fall from the window of his car, but his thoughts were far away, tangled in the sound of his daughter's laughter. They had begun to greet him without hesitation now, running toward him at the park with the kind of joy that made his chest tighten. They called him by name, not Dad yet, but his name. It was a start. Still, Jonathan knew the balance was fragile. Claire remained careful, always watching from the edges, her eyes sharp with quiet questions. Each visit was still a test, and though he had begun to earn small victories, he understood the weight of her silence. Trust was being built, brick by brick, and could be broken in an instant. The test arrived sooner than he expected. It was late one evening when Jonathan's phone rang. He had been reviewing documents for a deal that once would have consumed his entire attention. But now the sight of Claire's name flashing across the screen pulled every thought away. He answered quickly. Her voice was rushed, edged with worry. "Jonathan, I need your help." He stood immediately. "What happened?" "It's Anna," Claire said, her voice trembling slightly. "She's sick, a fever that won't break. I've tried everything, but she's burning up, and the clinic's lines are full. I don't have a car, and I don't want to wait." Jonathan didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in 10 minutes." When he arrived, Claire stood at the door with Anna in her arms, the little girl's face flushed and her body limp against her mother's shoulder. The other twin, Sophie, clung to Claire's leg, wide-eyed and frightened. Jonathan's chest tightened at the sight, but he forced calm into his voice. "Let's go. I'll drive." Claire hesitated only for a second before following him to the car. Jonathan held the back door open, and Claire slid in with both girls, cradling Anna against her chest. The drive to the hospital was tense, the air thick with fear. Jonathan kept glancing in the mirror, catching sight of Claire whispering soothing words, Sophie clutching her hand tightly. At the hospital, he stayed by Claire's side as doctors whisked Anna away for tests. For the first time, Jonathan saw Claire's armor crack. She sat in the waiting room, her hands shaking as she tried to stay composed for Sophie. Jonathan took the seat beside her, unsure if he had the right to reach out, but unable to stay still. "She'll be okay," he said softly, though his own voice trembled. Claire closed her eyes for a moment. "You don't know that." "No," he admitted, "but I'll be here. Whatever happens, I'll be here." Hours stretched long, but eventually the doctor returned with relief in his voice. It was an infection, serious but treatable. Anna would need a few days of rest and medication, but she would recover fully. Claire's shoulders sagged with relief, tears sliding down her cheeks as she whispered a quiet thank you. In that moment, Jonathan realized something profound. He wasn't there as a businessman, or even as the man Claire had once loved. He was there as a father, steady in the moment his family needed him most. And when Claire leaned against the chair, exhausted, she didn't push him away when he gently rested his hand over hers. The days that followed deepened the shift. Jonathan visited every day while Anna recovered, bringing simple things, a favorite stuffed animal from home, soup Claire hadn't had time to make, coloring books to keep Sophie calm. He didn't try to overtake Claire's role. He simply supported, filling in the gaps where she was stretched thin. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her guarded eyes softened. One afternoon, Sophie climbed onto his lap in the hospital room, holding out a book. "Can you read this to me?" she asked, her voice small but insistent. Jonathan's breath caught, but he opened the book, his voice steadying as he read aloud. Claire watched quietly from the other bed, her hands stroking Anna's hair as she slept. In that simple moment, Jonathan felt something change. He was no longer an outsider. He was becoming part of their world. When Anna was finally discharged, the girls clung to Jonathan as much as to Claire, and as he drove them home, Claire glanced at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, caution, something more he dared not name. That night, after the girls were asleep, Claire met him at the door. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, as though deciding whether to speak the words caught on her tongue. Finally, she said, "They're starting to trust you." Jonathan nodded, his chest heavy with both joy and fear. "I won't let them down." Claire's eyes softened, but her voice carried weight. "You can't disappear again, Jonathan. Not ever. They'll break if you do." He swallowed hard, meeting her gaze. "I know, and I won't. I swear it." For the first time, Claire didn't argue. She simply studied him, as though trying to decide whether the man in front of her was truly different from the one who had once turned away. Jonathan walked into the night with a new resolve burning inside him. The test had come, and he had chosen to stay. He had been present in their darkest moment, and for once, he hadn't run. Yet as he drove through the quiet streets, another thought echoed inside him. This was only the beginning. Winning trust wasn't about one act of love. It was about living it every day, proving that he could be the man they needed, even when life grew hard again. And somewhere deep inside, he knew another test was waiting. Something greater, something that would demand not just presence, but sacrifice. The winter melted into spring, and with it, Jonathan found his world reshaped. The girls no longer looked at him as a stranger. They began to call his name with the same casual trust they gave their mother. At first, it was tentative, his name spoken softly, almost like a question. But soon, it carried laughter, demands, and even the occasional scolding when he failed to keep up with their games. Each time they reached for his hand, something inside him healed, though another part ached with the knowledge of all the years he had missed. Claire noticed the change too. She no longer hovered as closely during visits, though she remained watchful. Jonathan could see it in her eyes, a fragile thread of trust being woven, not yet complete, but no longer impossible. He had promised her consistency, and he had delivered. Yet he knew the final measure of his worth had not yet come. Words and promises were not enough. Sooner or later, life would test him again. The test came in a way he never expected. One morning, Jonathan received a call from his firm. A monumental deal, the kind that could secure his empire for decades, was on the table. The final signing was scheduled overseas, and his presence was deemed essential. Colleagues urged him to board the private jet waiting for him, to seize the opportunity that could define the rest of his career. In the past, he would have said yes without hesitation, but as he stood in his office, suitcase open on the desk, a small hand-drawn picture caught his eye. Sophie had given it to him days earlier, a crayon sketch of their family, Claire, the twins, and him. They were holding hands under a sun too large for the page. That evening was supposed to be Anna and Sophie's school performance. They had been rehearsing for weeks, proudly singing the lines of their song every time he visited. "You'll be there, right?" they had asked him, their eyes wide, their voices bubbling with hope. He had promised, without thinking twice. Now, the choice loomed before him, the deal of a lifetime, or the daughters who had only just begun to believe in him. For the first time in his life, the decision felt simple. He closed the suitcase. He called his assistant, his voice steady. "Cancel the flight. Tell them I'm not going." The shock on the other end didn't matter. The fury of investors didn't matter. For once, Jonathan chose something greater than ambition. That night, he sat in a crowded school auditorium, wedged between parents who had no idea who he was outside those walls. When the curtain rose and the girls appeared on stage, their eyes scanned the crowd nervously until they found him. Their faces lit up, and in that instant, Jonathan knew he had made the only choice that mattered. After the performance, they ran to him, their small arms wrapping around his waist. "You came," Anna exclaimed, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "I promised, didn't I?" Jonathan whispered, bending to meet their eyes. He felt tears sting as Sophie placed the paper crown from her costume on his head, giggling. "Now you're one of us," she declared. Claire stood nearby, watching. Her smile was faint but real, the kind of smile that carried years of buried hope. Jonathan met her gaze, and for the first time, he didn't see only caution. He saw something. Softer acknowledgement, maybe even belief. Weeks turned into months, and Jonathan's priorities shifted entirely. He restructured his life, stepping back from the endless chase of wealth. He still worked, but his evenings belonged to his daughters, the bedtime stories, the homework struggles, the laughter that filled the walls of Claire's home. Slowly, carefully, Claire let him deeper into their lives, though she never let him forget the weight of his responsibility. The final moment came on a summer afternoon. The girls were playing in the yard, their voices carrying through the open window. Claire sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her eyes thoughtful. Jonathan sat across from her, waiting. "They love you," she said finally, her voice steady. "They trust you, and I see the man you're trying to be." Jonathan's chest tightened. "I'll never stop trying. Not for them, not for you." Claire looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then keep showing up. That's all I ask. Not perfection, just presence outside." The girls shouted for him to join their game. Jonathan rose, stepping toward the door, his heart fuller than it had ever been. As he walked into the sunlight, the sound of their laughter washing over him, he realized something profound. This glare, Anna. Sophie, this was the empire he had been searching for all along. Not towers of glass and steel, not contracts or applause. This was love, fragile yet unbreakable. Built not by ambition, but by choice. And for the first time, Jonathan understood the true measure of wealth. He had once ignored a message that could have changed everything. Now, he listened to every word, every laugh, every moment, and he vowed never to turn away again. The story was no longer about what he had lost. It was about what he had found.